Our last presenter of the day before our discussant and our Q&A session is Matthew Paulus. Matthew is a senior archaeologist with the Ottery Group in Maryland and an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Maryland. He holds a doctoral degree from Columbia University and a Master of Applied Anthropology from the University of Maryland in College Park. He's an archaeologist. He has been an archaeologist in Maryland for 20 years with experience in all levels of investigation at historic sites throughout the Middle Atlantic. His focus is on historical sites pertaining to urban development and modern infrastructure, post-emancipation African American life, and military sites. Matt's publications include the book co-authored with Paul Shackle titled They Worked Regular, Craft, Labor, and Family in the Industrial Community of Virginius Island. So please join me in welcoming Matthew Paulus to the podium.
Okay, thank you. I first want to just thank and congratulate you on this successful symposium. This thing is so well put together, and it's been a pleasure to be here. So today I want to talk about the history of episodic displacements, evictions of African American communities in Washington, D.C. and its suburbs in Montgomery County, and connect this history to the present-day moment of hyperdevelopment that raises up the remains of those communities as archaeology, a heritage of free black settlement in Montgomery County in places that are now DC's majority white suburbs. Until recently, Montgomery County had no formal proactive protections for archaeological sites as part of the planning process. Neighboring Prince George's County, which contains the eastern suburbs of Washington and is historically a focus of African American suburban settlement and land wealth, Prince George's County has a regulation whereby subdivision of land triggers a review of project plans for impacts to uninventoried archaeological resources. And this is coordinated by a county archaeologist who can require surveys and, where necessary, testing and mitigation. This regulation was introduced during the 1990s specifically to protect unmarked African American cemeteries associated with former plantations and postbellum settlements. But it has grown to be a systematic check on uncontrolled destruction of archaeological sites. Montgomery County has no such protections in place except for a very new review of land development plans for known marked and unmarked cemeteries. Montgomery County has a hard-working archaeology program, but it is in the Parks Department. Planning and Zoning just hired its first archaeologist a couple of years ago to answer this change in the county code that I will come around to at the end of my presentation. So in the present moment of overdevelopment in the Washington-Baltimore area and in Northern Virginia, a land grab is taking place that sees Washington suburbs literally running out of undeveloped land. The game among developers appears to be a race to fill out the last large multi-acre parcels with townhomes, extract those profits now before another recession hits, and as quickly as possible while the business model still works, and then see who gets to retire first. In this climate, aging developments from mid-century also become attractive, so that the places where former African American communities had been developed over in the 1950s and the 60s are being redeveloped in a way that creates potential to encounter traces of those former communities, and for those traces to become heritage, to become assets in the struggle for justice. And really, they may or may not become heritage, they may or may not become sites of struggle. That depends on the composition of each scenario. So in the first movement, there's African American settlement outside of the jurisdiction of municipalities like Washington, and where there is a greater degree of freedom in regards to land use. This is before the introduction of master plans and zoning codes, where these spaces were not governed in the same way that urban places are governed. And they featured apparent greater security from displacement because lands available for purchase by African Americans are not always the most favorable places to live and farm. So more so they are the lands that are allowed to African Americans by grudging consent of whites. And I'm thinking of Cheryl LaRoche's book, Free Black Communities and the Underground Railroad, where she says place names betray the marginality of these places. So for instance, Brightwood's African American community in DC was called Vinegar Hill, and the Scotland community in Montgomery County was initially known as Snake Den, and there are a number of other examples like that. So these are the communities that were oftentimes displaced by that first wave of post-World War II suburban development. Assembly of large parcels of land for commercial and residential real estate projects where the historical pattern of community building that we all know usually sees a single or a few large tracts coming into African American ownership before or after the Civil War, and then that land is split within families until a 50-acre tract becomes 50 individual home and farm lots. Real estate speculators in the mid-20th century undid all of that in a very vulgar process that reversed all of those transfers of heritable land, all of those gifts that traced out family relations, to reassemble the parcels, reducing all of that significance to the real estate value of the empty land, price per acre. And then there are highway projects that are indifferent to the presence of existing communities, and establishment of parklands and water control projects in the stream valleys of the Potomac River tributaries. So this is followed either by reestablishment of displaced communities further out from the city, or dispersal and resettlement following available support of family networks in the area. So that's sort of the model that you can see repeating over and over and over again. And for me as a contract archaeologist, from project to project to project, it really becomes familiar. And by way of example, I wanted to talk about the Scotland community in Montgomery County on the west side of Cabin John Regional County Park. So the African American community at Scotland traces its founding to 1879 purchase at auction of 36 acres by a man named William Dove, one progenitor of a large clan that remains associated with the Scotland community today. Scotland grew to approximately 75 African American families by the mid-20th century. Now, towards mid-century, Montgomery County began condemning land in Scotland and the surrounding area to create Cabin John Regional Park, sort of a stream valley park that Montgomery County planners love. And then developers began to buy out small landowners, assembling large parcels for redevelopment. And the community understood perfectly well what was happening, and news accounts include their point of view. They complained to the press that developers and the county authorities were working together to drive them out. For instance, Montgomery County would condemn a property as unsanitary. In 1965, none of the homes in Scotland had water, municipal sewer. A few of them were electrified, but it was really very badly neglected. Montgomery County would condemn a property as unsanitary and then in the same breath deny a permit to build out for an indoor toilet or install a septic field, invoking some section of the zoning code that was really instrumentalized community displacement. Montgomery County offered Scotland residents $3,000 an acre for their property. But replied one resident, a Scotland woman named Geneva Mason, quote, "Where can we go to get a house for that? These people were born here. Their ancestors lived here. We want to stay here. This is their property, and we don't want to leave it," end quote. In this context, in 1965, 100 people representing Scotland attended a meeting of the Montgomery County Planning Board, stood in unison, and presented a petition bearing 1,000 signatures in support of a motion that the planning board stop buying up property in Scotland, one of them stating to the board, quote, "Don't take what is ours. You need people like us in the county as much as you need some of your white rich people," end quote. And that was Geneva Mason as well. Montgomery County stopped acquiring new lands and threw its support behind a project that was called the Scotland Community Apartments Townhome Development. The first such affordable housing project in Montgomery County, built between 1968 and 1971. And that's a remarkable story in itself, but I don't want to move on too quickly from that moment where this community seizes a planning board meeting by force of numbers. And that's what it takes to be heard, and that's what they do. So Scotland residents, in the face of this losing battle, basically decided to pool their land and then receive equity shares in a new housing development. And that's the current Scotland community. That's the current Scotland community in the lower right. So this was built in part with a Federal Housing Administration demonstration grant that was secured in 1965 and a $1.6 million Federal Housing Administration loan to construct the townhomes. And the units were filled as quickly as they were completed. The 100-unit townhome was development began in 67 and was completed by 71. And this action maintained the cohesion and stability of the Scotland community. So circumstances of land ownership in Scotland had become complicated to the point of obscurity by mid-century, and this was discovered as essentially allies were helping to research and clarify titles to the land in Scotland so that it could be sold to support the condominium development. The Evening Star, one of the local papers, described how, quote, tracts cut up and handed down from one generation to the next have cloudy titles. Many of the lots are too small to meet county minimum legal requirements for septic tanks and wells, end quote. And this is the essential technique for distribution of heritable wealth within African-American families running afoul of new zoning codes that can designate a parcel too small to live on. The Montgomery County Sentinel reported in 1965 that, quote, much of the land is in joint or indeterminate ownership, making it difficult at present for individuals or families to sell even if they wanted to do so, end quote. And around the same period of time, the NAACP reported that Scotland was representative of 10 or 15 African-American communities in this part of the DC suburbs. When a regionally significant developer named Carl M. Freeman began to acquire land in Scotland during the mid-1950s, at least 6 families found that their homes now stood on Freeman's land. They thought they owned the property where they resided, but they didn't, allowing the land to be bought out from underneath them. Freeman brought suit against 3 families, and Montgomery County courts gave them 6 months to find other housing. Similar scenarios arose with the county's acquisition of land in the Stream Valley for Cabin John, where evictees from Freeman property moved to minimally livable houses situated on county property and were yet again evicted. So developer Carl Freeman acquired much of the land in Scotland by 1955, enough land to build a mall and a shopping center that was constructed between 1968 and the 1970s. And this mall is now badly outdated and proposed for redevelopment, that cannibal moment of capitalism where development consumes itself. Montgomery County Planning wanted to know if there was any evidence that former cemetery lands were present in the location of the shopping center. This is, you can't appreciate how much asphalt this is. They do not build them like this anymore, you know? At the time, Montgomery County's Planning Department had permit authority over the redevelopment. And while there was no procedural protection for cultural resources, under the existing development code, they needed to avoid a controversy from potential disturbance of a cemetery. And documentary research did locate a previously unknown cemetery on land north of the shopping center project associated with the Dove family. That is, it's a small cemetery associated with the Dove family. And this land was sold during the 1920s, but the sale excluded a small parcel containing the family cemetery. And this area is now part of another development, an adjacent development, and there's no indication that the cemetery is there. The condition of the cemetery is unknown, and its designation is lost, reed, laundered, as the land was sold and resold between developers several times between the 1920s and the 1960s. So this narrative of Scotland's displacement, which is remarkable, is an example of the pattern that everyone in the room, I think, can recognize. Let's see. Okay, so this just shows the location of Scotland in the upper left, and then the Scotland Community Apartments townhome development a little further south. And then in the lower part of the screen is Moses Cemetery, the River Road neighborhood of Bethesda, and you can barely make out the border of Washington, D.C. In fact, probably not at all. But anyway, I'm shifting over to a new area of Montgomery County. The care given to finding this cemetery in Scotland is because of events surrounding another supposedly lost cemetery earlier in the same year. In 2017, my firm was contracted to carry out an assessment of a 20th century African-American cemetery located in Bethesda, Maryland in Montgomery County, known as Moses Cemetery, which operated from 1911 to 1950. And Moses Cemetery actually operated within the District of Columbia. That is, it was formerly located within the District of Columbia during the 1880s and 1890s. It was condemned by an act of Congress. And the trustees of the cemetery purchased land in Bethesda thinking that was a safe distance from the city and relocated the cemetery in 1911. So figuring and calculating how many individuals are interred in Moses Cemetery begins with the number of interments in Moses Cemetery in Washington. So like many postbellum African-American suburban developments, and as I've been discussing, the community was pushed out of the River Road area of Bethesda during the boom in suburban development after World War II. The struggle over the cemetery became very intense by the end of 2017, and that struggle successfully brought about change through civil disobedience, while I participated as an agent of development in the midst of a brief eruption of public historical consciousness that was forced by protest. Let me see what other slides. Yeah. So several years ago, Montgomery County developed a sector plan. And this is a binding planning document for the area of Bethesda containing the cemetery, which promoted redevelopment of the area that had been built up during the 50s and the 60s, entailing significant abuse of the cemetery. That is, significant abuse that was perpetrated in the 50s and the 60s, but not relocation of the cemetery. Sorry, let me say that again. The cemetery was disturbed, abused, but not relocated. The burials weren't moved. There may have been some illicit removal of individual burials, extra legal, but there's no record. Historians in the Montgomery County Planning Department began to document the African American heritage of the area, including the existence of the cemetery that had been built over during construction of a high-rise apartment completed in 1968. And just as a for instance, so, you know, a 1917 real estate atlas that indicates ownership of the land by White's Tabernacle, the trustees of the cemetery, and then a death certificate. This was just sort of proof of concept for everyone involved that what it would take to figure out who's buried in Moses Cemetery. These are held at the state archive, but they're alphabetical by name. You would basically have to look at everyone in Montgomery County from a period of time and find the line where it says that they're interred in Moses Cemetery, this Moses Cemetery, not the other Moses cemeteries in the region. And then this is something that, so this is a terrible photograph, but this is the only image of this plat that I have. This came from the personal papers of the son of the architect who built the apartment towers I'm going to talk about, the apartment towers that rest on top of the cemetery. So in their possession was a plat that showed the former location of Moses Cemetery. So this was sort of a knowingly perpetrated. He recanted this. And Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission, the entity who did not build sewers and water infrastructure for Scotland, built a major storm drain right across the property containing the cemetery. The trustees of the cemetery gave them an easement, which I think means that they knew this wasn't going to disturb any graves. And this is sort of the location of the cemetery before and after the super development of the neighborhood post-war period. So in the final draft of the sector plan, the formal planning document, information about the former African American community was stripped out, placed in sidebars, or moved to a second volume of appendices that didn't have the same binding status as the approved sector plan. So the sector plan is enforceable, but the appendices are not. The final sector plan also described the cemetery as no longer extant, even though historians in the planning department seem to agree that the parcels containing the cemetery should be considered highly sensitive for intact unmarked burials. The county uncovered no evidence that the cemetery had been moved. I tried for a couple of months to identify any evidence, and there's no documentation that it had been moved. And this is something, 1965 is not that long ago. It's hard to convince people that you could do this, that you could just completely blitz an African-American cemetery, that it would be done that way, because it seems so recently. But of course it would be done that way, or could be done that way, A second problem was that Montgomery County circulated drafts of their own research internally and marked it confidential. But these materials were obtained by opponents of the proposed development through a FOIA request, and it really seemed as though the county was attempting to cover up the existence of the cemetery and keep it out of planning documents. So my firm entered the picture at this crisis point, starting from a place where trust in Montgomery County authorities was completely lacking, really the culmination of a 75-year history with Montgomery County planning. A very well-organized and highly skilled group of activists had all found each other during development of the sector plan that was finalized in 2017, and then a private developer filed a preliminary plan to build a parking garage on the parcel containing the cemetery. The opponents of this plan, consisted of a group of environmental activists seeking to protect part of the Potomac River watershed and a Baptist church that rallied support for the cemetery, receiving assistance and advice from Doctors Michael Blakey and Rachel Watkins at American University. So based on some successful collaborations with African American communities in DC and good word of mouth, the Macedonia Baptist Church in Bethesda selected my firm to investigate the cemetery. They directed the developer to hire us to assess the cemetery via non-invasive geophysical survey. So these are all the right ingredients, but the collaboration failed. We had 2 meetings with the church that represented descendants of the River Road community. In the first one, we laid out the basis for a partnership, but the second one became confrontational. Advocates for the cemetery could not abide the Ottery Group working under contract with the developers. And they realized that they had enabled the development to move forward by providing their endorsement for our firm. And they told us flatly that they consent to no work on the property. The county made offers to compensate Drs. Blakey and Watkins to provide oversight of our investigation of the cemetery, but this wasn't adequate as a remedy. The advocates would not accept any outcome that did not entail pretty profound structural changes in the planning process. Protests were organized and maintained pressure on the county in response. Advocates for the cemetery broke up public hearings, held sit-ins at county offices, used the press, and filed lawsuits. Advocates for the cemetery held firmly to their objective, which was in part just to receive fair treatment and consideration from the county, to have a voice. So as an example, they would attend planning hearings in large groups, and the chair of the planning department for Montgomery County would say, well, you have to designate one of you to speak for the group. And that was it. They exposed the fact that fair treatment consideration would necessitate elemental changes in the county's governance over development. In this instance, Moses Cemetery understood as heritage created a flashpoint. Descendants initially were interested in recognition of this heritage, recognition of the fact that African American people once were part of Bethesda, that the River Road community had been there, and that their dead were still buried in that ground. This eventually became about control of the heritage and the ability of the community to shape the planning process. And this is also the embrace of a heritage of protest and direct challenge for Montgomery County planners to change how they do things. Thank you.